Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, we are going to start looking at some institutional security, and we're going to start with financial institutions. And financial institutions security focuses on providing security for institutions that deal with currency, such as commercial banks, credit unions, investment bankers, operators of credit card systems, and insurance companies. All of these organizations are attractive targets for robbery, theft, embezzlement, fraud, and hacking. So one of the first early attempts at financial security institution was the Bank Protection Act of 1968, and this was legislation that was introduced to rescue or to I review the vulnerability of financial institutions by requiring them to develop written security plans and also to institute the presence of security guards. Banks are obviously very vulnerable given, to theft and to robbery, given the amount of currency on site. They also have extended operating hours outside of normal daily business operating hours, which can make them vulnerable. Staff is usually not armed, and security plan, or excuse me, and they are trained to be as compliant as possible in the face of a robbery so that there are no fatalities and there are no injuries. The following policies are in place to deter bank robberies. The first is going to be to reduce rewards. We want to limit the availability of money on site. The less money on site at any given time, obviously, the less attractive that target is. And then we want to use things like die packs so that if somebody does get the money off the premises in a robbery, it's useless because when they go to dismantle that money from the packets, the die packs explode. That die will never come off the money, and if they try to use that currency, it's obvious that they obtained it in a robbery. We also want to increase the perception of risk. So we want to use things like physical barriers, which you've all seen this at banks that you go to in person where they have those partitions between, the bank tellers and where the currency is behind the partition and the robber or the people who come up to the bank teller. They also introduce things like slow moving revolving doors so that if somebody is trying to get out of the building quickly after robbing it, they can't. There's incredibly heavy, slow moving revolving doors, take a minute. We also want to increase the risk of apprehension. So we want to do things like hide tracking devices and chips and transponders in packets of money so that that money can be tracked after it leaves the premises after a robbery. We also offer things like rewards in the community for turning people in. And of course, really basic measures like instituting alarm systems. Another way to increase the difficulty of offending is to use ATMs for cash withdrawal. Don't utilize bank tellers if you don't, you can't threaten an ATM with violence the way you can a human bank teller. Use things like man traps, so having vestibules where the door behind you locks and keeps you in a holding area before the door in front of you will unlock so that you're effectively trapped in a small room, which makes coming and going much slower process. And also if somebody is robbing the bank as they flee, people can lock them into that vestibule, so that people can't move with ease in and out of the institution. Another option is providing ATM security. So obviously an ATM, you've all used them, they're computers that distribute money. There's a finite amount of funds in the computer. So if the ATM does get robbed, the damage is mitigated. And they have to be manually reloaded. So again, there's only a certain amount of money that you're going to get out of an ATM. However, that doesn't mean that people don't try to rob ATMs. People do. And a really common method of doing that is something called ram raiding. And that is where there's an attack on an ATM where the perpetrator just rams the ATM with heavy equipment, whether it's an automobile or some other, piece of heavy equipment to effectively break the ATM open so that they can take the cash. Or in some cases, they just take the entire machine where they can go back to a private location and attempt to open it. In order to mitigate these ram attacks, ATMs are now often mounted into cement walls or they're mounted into concrete pavement so that people can't ram them and people can't pick them up and just take off with them. And if those ATMs are removed, they're often equipped with alert alarms so that if they are in transit, it will ping, the home office and let the home office know that the ATM has been stolen. There are other forms of ATM fraud. So the first one is called skimming. And this is a card reader device that is installed into the ATM, which will store a magnetic strip from the next user. So it's entered in there. The next user puts their card in, and it stores their magnetic strip. If you have somebody in the environment in the area, and/or a covert reader that allows for the theft of the PIN, that coupled with the access to the strip allows people to access people's bank accounts and drain them. There's also something called card trapping. This is fraud where the user is trapped. You put your card in and it's trapped in the ATM. It won't come back out. While it's in there and it's being trapped, the PIN is being collected by a fraudulent party. The card is withdrawn at a later time, and they can, again, use it to gather your information and drain your bank accounts. There's also something called the Lebanese loop, and that is a thin plastic sleeve that is inserted into the ATM. So when the next user comes along and they put their card in there, they're actually also putting it into that thin plastic strip. It gets caught in that sleeve. And then the user leaves thinking the ATM is malfunctioning, and the person who inserted the strip comes along, removes the plastic strip with the card in it, and then goes and uses that ATM card for purchases until it is canceled. And finally, there's something called PIN cracking, and that's the use of electronic devices to identify another user's PIN. So let's switch gears here a little bit and look at another institution, and that next institution is going to be the criminal justice system and courtrooms. Courtroom security is a huge area of focus. Providing courtroom security is important for everybody who goes in the courtroom, but in particular, going to be there's heavy emphasis on the judge, the prosecutor, and if it's a jury trial, maintaining jury safety as well. There's a lot of emotions that run high in courtrooms, right? People are being convicted. They're losing their freedom for extended periods of time. People are losing money. People are losing custody of their children. Divorces are happening. Divorces can be quite acrimonious, especially in cases where one party does not want the divorce. So there's a lot of things that drive a lot of high emotions in courtrooms, which makes courtrooms very vulnerable for physical outbursts, physical attacks, violence, retaliation at judges who do sentencing, etc. So there's a tremendous amount of reason and motivation, justification behind courtroom attacks, and therefore there's a huge need and a huge demand for courtroom security, and instituting those security measures is of extreme importance, because we can't have justice will stop working if we know that judges can be attacked, or judges can be killed, or prosecutors or witnesses can be killed in the courtroom. So typically speaking, generally speaking, the person who provides that courtroom security is a bailiff. However, in the state of Pennsylvania, that jurisdiction, role is given to the sheriff deputy. That is a role of a sheriff deputy. And these are members of law enforcement that are always present in the courtroom. They're there to manage unruly spectators. So, if people start speaking out, if people start standing up, getting upset, getting physical, they will arrest them. They will remove them. They have been trained to spot these red flags early on, and to keep an eye on people that they think may cause an issue. They're also there to provide jury safety and jury custody. So they get the jury in and out of the courtroom safely, making sure that the jury and the defendant never cross paths, which could lead to a mistrial. In cases where the juries are sequestered, they are responsible for getting the jury from and to the courthouse and to the hotel, making sure that the juries get fed, making sure that the juries are not having external contact if they are sequestered and they're not allowed access to news media and so forth. Also making sure that nobody has access to the juries for interviews, things of that nature. And ultimately, they're there to respond to any violent outbursts in the courtroom and to manage the defendant in and out of custody. In addition to all of this, they are responsible for management of the courtroom when there is no active case going on. It is their responsibility before court to sweep the courtroom, and in particular, the judges' chambers, to identify any hazards, any threats to safety. It's also their job to handle traffic flow at the front of the courthouse. Anytime you enter a courthouse, you will see sheriff's deputies here in the state of PA managing the magnetometer, which is that big door-shaped thing that you have to walk through, which is effectively, it's an x-ray machine, and they're x-raying your body. They will also take all of your goods and put it through the x-ray machine to make sure that you don't have any weapons on your person or in any of your personal effects. As a measure of security, it is a choke point to make sure that nothing gets into the courthouse that could cause any of the courthouse actors harm. In addition, CCTV is a commonplace courthouse method of oversight and evaluation for situational security. And it is also that CCTV is also used after the fact when there are incidents that CCTV footage is reviewed to see where were there holes in our security so that we can patch up those holes. Let's shift to yet another institution, and that's going to be educational institutions. Educational institutional safety has been a huge and very controversial hot topic in the past 2 decades, given the increase of mass shootings on school grounds and school campuses. Unfortunately, I don't feel that just, we've done enough for our educational institutions in terms of instituting security. We have done a few things, but nothing of any magnitude, obviously, because we continue to have mass shootings. Um, but we have changed some things all the way from kindergarten until grade 12, and also in post-secondary education at colleges and universities in order to institute security protocols, largely to target harden the environment. And what that means is hardening the targets, making them harder to victimize through mass shootings. In order to prevent school violence. In addition, most schools, all schools, colleges, and universities have implemented plans of response so that if there is active violence or if there is an active shooter on the campus, that they have a plan of action that just gets enacted rather than coming out and responding cold. One of the target hardening measures that has been taken largely by schools is the introduction of an SRO, which is a school resource officer. Excuse me. These are members of sworn law enforcement. They are actual law enforcement that work with schools. They are armed. They are on site. They get all the training that law enforcement all gets. Some schools have the same SRO on site at all times. Sometimes schools will have, it depends on the jurisdiction and levels of funding, but they'll have, a multitude of SROs that cycle in and out of the school. Some are on site every day, some are on site a few days a week. And the SRO is there to be a deterrent for violence, first and foremost, but also that they have an immediate first responder on scene in the event of a mass violence circumstance, that you have armed personnel who is right there. But the job of an SRO is bigger than that. They're also a resource for administration. So if there's a school fight, if there's any sort of violence on campus, they often step in and handle it in addition to administration. And they're also there to be a community member of school. Okay. One of the ways they prevent violence, or hopefully prevent violence, is by getting to know the student body and, engaging with the kids, being seen as somebody who's approachable if there are threats, so that kids feel comfortable coming to the SRO and saying, hey, I saw these drawings in a kid's notebook, or this kid was talking about, shooting up the school, or bringing guns to school, or they said they brought a gun to school, that people know the SRO, kids know the SRO, and they're comfortable approaching them with issues. They're also there to just foster community, right? A really good SRO, like I said, will know the kids by sight. They'll know them by name. They'll engage with them. I've heard stories of SROs, joining in basketball games after school, or something of that nature. Again, becoming a part of community, and helping to keep the entire school safe. Some schools have also instituted metal detectors, which I think is a really good thing. I'd like to see more of it. I know that tends to be controversial. People feel like, well, and it's like sending our kids to school. Yeah, I'd like to know that I can send my kid to school where nobody can get a metal firearm through a metal detector. I feel like this is an underutilized technique. There's also some schools who are manipulating the environment and creating bottlenecks in and out of the school, to catch weapons, but also to make it, the school less accessible, right? That there aren't multiple doors of entry and exit where people can come in unknown or unforeseen to the school campus, such as, was the case in Uvalde. More school administrators and student bodies are undergoing active shooter training, and all schools have intruder drills, which are, sort of they're locked down in place drills. It's not the best protocol. There are other protocols out there that train other ways, train for students if they can to flee. In some cases, they train students that if the mass shooter enters the classroom, they train them to fight back. But the general rule of thumb across the United States is to lock in place and shelter. Some schools, colleges, and universities in particular are making use of emergency notification systems, whereby if there is an event of any sort of mass problem, if there's a mass shooter, if there's a tornado, whatever it is that threatens the environment, everybody's cell phones are registered and they will be pinged with emergency emails and emergency text messages that are set telling them that there's a situation and telling them what to do. So if you're in XYZ building, you need to be on lockdown. It's not safe. Lockdown, shelter in place. Or if you're in XYZ building, get out of the building now, get off of the premises. Typically, schools will have sort of a rally site, and they'll say, go to the rally site for safety. And finally, more religious institutions are also adopting security tactics similar to what's going on in schools, because we have seen an uptick in mass shootings in houses of worship. So more and more religious institutions are taking a page from educational institution security and mimicking their security responses and measures.